I didn't say a word when my daughter handed me the papers and told me to sign. I just sat there in what used to be my favorite chair, the leather one by the window that looked out over the back field, and I read every line. Slowly. The way I used to read briefs before I cross-examined witnesses. My daughter stood over me with her arms crossed, and her husband leaned against the doorframe with that expression he always wore. The one that said he'd already won. Power of attorney. Full financial and medical authority transferred to Sandra Lee Monroe and Derek Allen Monroe. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the end table, folded my hands in my lap and said, "I'll think about it." That was the beginning. My name is Harold Calloway. I'm 72 years old. For 31 years, I was a federal prosecutor in the District of Vermont. Before that, I was a public defender. Before that, I was a kid from Burlington who worked 2 jobs to put himself through law school while everyone around him told him he was reaching too far. I prosecuted organized crime, drug trafficking, public corruption. I sent 2 sitting state legislators to prison. I put a sitting county sheriff away for 8 years. The governor called me personally to thank me when I retired. My photograph hangs in the corridor of the federal courthouse on Elmwood Avenue, between a man who died in office and a woman who went on to the Second Circuit. My daughter never came to that ceremony. She was busy, she said. Derek had a conference. I told myself it didn't matter. Eleanor, my wife of 44 years, she squeezed my hand at the reception and said, "You know she loves you in her own way." Eleanor always found the grace in people that I couldn't find myself. It was her best quality, and sometimes, in hindsight, her worst. Eleanor passed 18 months ago. A stroke. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. I was the one who found her, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee cup still warm beside her hand. Sandra flew in for the funeral. She cried the right amount. She hugged me the right amount. Then she and Derek flew back to Connecticut, and I was alone in the farmhouse in Addison County that Eleanor and I had bought with cash in 1987. 14 acres. A red barn I never used. A garden Eleanor kept until she couldn't anymore. The house was worth a great deal more than we paid for it. I knew that. I also knew that Sandra knew that, because 3 weeks after the funeral, Derek called me to discuss estate planning. I'm a retired federal prosecutor. I know what estate planning sounds like when someone else is doing the planning. I let them come. That's the thing people don't understand. When you've spent 30 years watching people make the same mistakes, you get very good at recognizing the patterns early. I could see exactly where this was going, from the first phone call, but I wanted to understand the full shape of it before I moved. That's how I'd always worked. Never interrupt a witness in the middle of a lie. Let them finish. Let them commit. Then take it apart piece by piece. Derek worked in commercial real estate. Not very successfully, as it turned out. He had the vocabulary of someone successful. He talked about portfolios and leverage and market cycles, but his shoes were always slightly worn, and Sandra had stopped wearing the watch her mother gave her at their wedding. I noticed those things. I noticed most things. They moved in 4 months after Eleanor died. Sandra said they were worried about me being alone. Derek said the commute to his office wasn't too bad from Vermont if he left early enough. I gave them the guest room, the good bathroom, full use of the kitchen. I thought, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe my daughter genuinely wants to be near her father. Maybe grief makes people do right by each other. That lasted about 6 weeks. It started small, the way it always does. Could I keep the television down after 9? Their sleep schedules were different from mine. Could I stop having my friend Ray over on Tuesday afternoons? Derek was on calls in the afternoons, and Ray's voice carried. Could I perhaps consider using the side entrance when I came back from my walks? They were using the mudroom as an office now. I said yes to all of it. Then Sandra sat me down one evening and said, very gently, that she was worried about my memory. I'd forgotten to take my blood pressure medication twice that week. I'd left the stove on once, which was true. And last Thursday, she said. I'd called her by her mother's name. I looked at her steadily. When did I do that? Thursday morning, Dad. When I came downstairs. Thursday morning I was at Ray's house. I left before 7. You can ask him. A small flicker behind her eyes. Well, maybe it was another day. The point is, we're concerned. I said I appreciated her concern. What I did not say was that I recognized this argument. I had used a version of it myself, more than once, when I was building a case around a vulnerable witness. You introduce the idea of unreliability early. You plant the seed. Later, when you need people to doubt them, the seed has already taken root. My daughter was building a case against me. I started paying attention the way I used to pay attention at trial. Not to what was being said, but to what was being arranged. Derek began making phone calls from the back porch with the door closed. Sandra started meeting with someone at the library in town. I know, because Ray saw her car there twice. And Ray notices things too. 3 envelopes arrived, addressed to Derek from a firm called Clearwater Fiduciary Services in Hartford. I looked them up. They specialized in guardianship proceedings and asset management for elderly clients. I went for a walk. 14 acres gives you a lot of room to think. Then, on a Thursday in late November, I came home from my walk to find Derek sitting at my desk in the study. My desk. He had the middle drawer open. He was photographing documents with his phone. "Can I help you with something?" I said from the doorway. He startled badly, knocked his knee on the desk. "Harold, I didn't hear you come in. I was just looking for a stamp." "The stamps are in the kitchen drawer." "They've always been in the kitchen drawer." He smiled the way people smile when they've been caught and have decided the best move is to act like they haven't. Force of habit, I guess. Former home office and all that. This was never his office. This was never his home. But I just nodded and stepped aside so he could pass. That evening I called my doctor and asked him, on the record and in writing, to document the fact that I was in full cognitive health. He'd already done a full workup 3 months prior. Everything fine. I asked him to date the letter and keep a copy in my file. Then I opened my laptop and I wrote an email to a man named Frank DeLuca. Frank retired from the FBI 6 years before I stopped prosecuting. We'd worked together for the better part of 2 decades. He knew things about my methods that I'd never written down anywhere. I knew things about his that he was grateful had never come out in court. We were what I'd call trusted adversaries who had gradually become friends. He lived in New Hampshire now, ran a small private consulting firm. His client list, as far as I could tell, consisted mostly of corporations that needed quiet investigations, conducted very carefully. The email was 4 sentences long. I told him I had a situation developing. I told him I needed someone watching from a distance. I told him not to contact me by phone, and I told him that Derek Monroe's financials would probably be interesting. He replied in 2 hours. "I'm already looking. You're not wrong to be concerned." That was in November. By February, I understood the full shape of what they were planning. The guardianship application had already been filed in Chittenden County. Sandra had submitted affidavits from herself and from Derek. She'd also submitted one from a doctor I had never met, a man who had apparently assessed my cognitive function based on a clinical interview conducted via telephone, which Sandra had arranged without telling me. This doctor had written that I showed signs consistent with early-stage cognitive decline and that independent decision-making might put me at material risk. They were going to have me declared incompetent. While the proceedings moved forward, Derek had already initiated contact with a property management group about listing the house. The listing paperwork was drafted. It was sitting in his email. Frank had found it. The house. Eleanor's house. The garden she planted. The window seat she built herself over one winter when she was pregnant with Sandra. I sat with that information for 2 days. I want to be honest about something. There was a part of me that still didn't want to believe it. She was my daughter. I had driven her to every piano lesson from age 6 to 14. I had sat in the 3rd row at her college graduation in the rain with a broken umbrella. I had paid for the wedding she and Derek had in the Berkshires that cost more than my first car. I had loved her the way you love someone who came from you, who used to fall asleep on your shoulder during long car trips. But she had filed guardianship papers in Chittenden County. She had paid a doctor she'd never introduced me to in order to call me incompetent. And her husband was in my study with his phone out, photographing documents. The 3rd morning, I called Frank. It was time. I want to explain something about why I didn't simply call the police. I know that seems like the obvious answer. People always assume the law is a straightforward tool. Pull the handle, justice comes out. But I'd spent 30 years watching what happened when cases were rushed, when evidence wasn't complete, when people moved before the picture was fully developed. Charges get reduced. Cases get thrown out on procedural grounds. People walk, and then they disappear. And then you can never rebuild what they destroyed while you were busy rushing. Derek had money problems that went far beyond me. Frank had uncovered this in his first week of looking. 3 investors in a Hartford development deal had lost a combined $800,000. 2 of them had filed civil complaints. There was a pattern specific, documented, and building towards something that was much larger than one farmhouse in Vermont. If I moved too soon, Derek would know Frank was involved. He'd cover what he could. The bigger case would evaporate. So I waited. I let them continue. I watched Sandra watch me. I watched Derek make his phone calls on the back porch. I took my walks. I called my doctor. I had dinner at Ray's house every Tuesday and we played cribbage, and I didn't say a word about any of it. Until the Saturday morning in March, when Sandra came to me with a brochure. It was for a facility called Whispering Pines in Middlebury. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, Eleanor's kitchen table, where 40 years of family dinners had happened, and she laid the brochure out in front of me like she was presenting a closing argument. "Derek and I have been talking," she said. "We think it might be time to have a real conversation about your long-term care." I looked at the brochure. Then I looked at her. "I see. Whispering Pines is really well reviewed. It's not far. We'd visit. I'm sure you would." "Dad," her voice softened in a way that I recognized from her teenage years, when she wanted something expensive. "You know this is just about making sure you're safe. What happens to the house?" A pause. Brief. But there. "We'd sell it. Obviously. Cover the costs of your care. Whatever's left goes into a trust. A trust you'd manage. A trust we'd manage. For you." I folded my hands on the table, the way I used to fold them when a witness said something I was going to dismantle very shortly. "Sandra, do you know what I did for 31 years? "Dad, this isn't. I'd like to answer that." "Do you know what I did?" She sat back, wrong-footed. "You were a prosecutor. I built cases. I spent 3 decades learning exactly how people deceive each other, how they construct narratives, how they use paperwork and language and legitimate-sounding institutions to take things that don't belong to them." I pushed the brochure back across the table. "I have been watching you and your husband for 4 months. I know about the guardianship filing. I know about the doctor you paid who has never examined me in person. I know about the listing agreement Derek has drafted for this property. And I know about the investors in Hartford." The color went out of her face. "The Hartford investors?" Derek's voice came from the hallway. He'd been listening. Of course he had. I turned to look at him. "Clearwater Fiduciary is an interesting firm. Did you know their managing director has his own regulatory history? That's the kind of detail that comes out when someone starts pulling threads." Derek stepped into the kitchen. His jaw was tight. "You've been investigating us? I've been paying attention. There's a difference. You can't prove anything. The guardianship is a legal proceeding. We have medical documentation. You have a telephone assessment from a physician who has never met me, conducted without my knowledge or consent, which constitutes a violation of Vermont medical ethics guidelines." I stood up. I was aware that my hip ached in cold weather, that I moved more carefully than I once did. I stood anyway. "I've also notified my attorney. Everything I know has been documented, dated, and filed with someone who is not in this house." Sandra made a sound I'd never heard her make before. Something between a word and not. Derek's eyes had gone cold. "You're bluffing. You're a sick old man trying to—" "Derek." I kept my voice exactly level, the way I'd kept it in courtrooms for 3 decades. "I am not sick. I am not old in any way that matters here, and I have never bluffed in my professional life." I looked at him steadily. "I'd like you both to leave this house. Today." What happened over the following 3 weeks happened mostly at a distance, which is the way it works when you've done the preparation correctly. Frank's contacts at the FBI field office in New Haven had been building a file on Derek for 8 months before I ever emailed Frank. The Hartford investors weren't the only ones. There were 14 total, across 3 states, in 2 separate schemes. The guardianship filing against me, combined with the fraudulent medical assessment, added federal elder fraud charges to a list that was already substantial. When agents arrived at the apartment Derek and Sandra had moved into in Burlington, they found records that had apparently been removed from what Derek had described as secure storage, but turned out to be a unit he'd rented under a variation of his middle name. He was arrested on a Tuesday. I know because Frank called me. Sandra's own exposure was more complicated. She had signed the guardianship papers. Her name was on the fiduciary arrangement. But whether she had known the full scope of Derek's other activities was something that took time to untangle. I did not rush that process. I did not make representations to investigators one way or the other about what my daughter had known. I gave them documents. I answered questions when asked. I let the process work the way the process was supposed to work. Derek was indicted on 7 counts, including wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and filing a fraudulent affidavit in a civil guardianship proceeding. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The case, as of my last conversation with Frank, was moving toward trial. Sandra called me from the parking lot of the Burlington courthouse on a Wednesday afternoon. It was raining. She cried not the right amount this time, but too much, in the broken way that I recognized as real. She said she hadn't known about the other investors. She said she'd trusted Derek because she'd wanted to trust someone. She said she was sorry about the doctor and the brochure and the papers she'd had me sign that I'd never actually signed because I'd said I'd think about it. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Sandra, I need you to understand something. Your mother would have forgiven you by now. That was who she was. I am not your mother." She cried harder. "I also need you to understand," I said, "that I am not cutting you off. You are my daughter. But whatever you think our relationship is going to look like going forward, it is going to be earned. Slowly. By you. Do you understand me?" A long silence. Then, "Yes. Good. Get out of the rain. Call me when you're home." She called that evening. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. A book she was reading. A recipe she was attempting. The way you talk to someone when both of you are rebuilding something from the foundation up and you don't know yet if the foundation will hold. I didn't know if it would, but I was still willing to find out. That surprised me a little. The guardianship case was dismissed with prejudice. My doctor's letter was entered into the record. The court issued a formal finding that the original filing had been based on fraudulent medical documentation. I now have a court document, properly certified, stating that Harold Calloway is in full possession of his faculties and his estate. I had it framed. It hangs in my study, next to a photograph of Eleanor in the garden. There are practical matters I want to mention, because I think they matter. I've revised my will. I've established a relationship with an elder law attorney who has nothing to do with Sandra or anyone connected to her. I've had a long conversation with Ray about what to do if I ever stop being reachable. These are things I should have done years ago, and I didn't, because I thought trust was a substitute for preparation. It isn't. Trust is something you build on top of preparation, not instead of it. My financial advisor has reviewed everything. The house is in a properly structured trust. The terms are clear. Nobody can move on it without a process that takes months and involves multiple independent parties. Eleanor would probably say, "I've made things too complicated." She believed in the basic goodness of people in a way that I admired and could never quite replicate. But she's not here to balance me out anymore, so I've done it my way. Frank came up for a weekend in April. We sat on the back porch and drank coffee and watched a pair of red-tailed hawks circle over the field behind the barn. He asked me if I was angry. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Not the way I expected," I said. "What way then?" "The way you're angry when something was preventable and you didn't prevent it. Not at them. At the time, I wasted being careful with people who weren't being careful with me." He nodded. "Frank is not a sentimental man. That's why I trust him." "She's still your daughter," he said. "Yes," I said. "She is." We sat with that for a while. There's a thing that happens when you've worked in law as long as I have. You stop being shocked by what people do to each other. You stop expecting betrayal to feel a certain way. You understand that most of it doesn't come from malice, it comes from fear, from debt, from the particular desperation that sets in when someone has been making bad choices for long enough that they can't see any exit except through someone else's door. I don't think Sandra's a bad person. I think she married a man whose bad choices gradually became her bad choices, and that she told herself what she needed to tell herself to keep going. I've prosecuted people in exactly that situation. I've also watched juries acquit them. Derek is a different matter. But Derek will stand in front of a jury and a federal judge, and whatever happens after that will happen without my involvement. I gave the government everything I had. The rest is not my work to do. The thing I think about most, on my morning walks across the backfield, is Eleanor. She would have seen it coming before I did. Not through legal analysis, but through instinct she had, the kind of instinct about people that takes a lifetime to develop and can't be taught. She would have pulled me aside after Derek's second visit and told me quietly that something was off. She would have been right. She was almost always right about those things, and I was almost always 3 months behind her, arriving at the same conclusion by a longer route. I tell her about it on Sundays. I drive to the cemetery on Route 17, and I stand at her headstone, and I tell her whatever has happened that week. It's not something I would have predicted myself doing before she died. I'm not a particularly spiritual man, but there's something in the speaking aloud of things that I've found genuinely useful. A kind of accounting. A way of being honest with yourself when the person who always held you honest is gone. Last Sunday, I told her that Sandra had come to visit, that we had sat at the kitchen table and drunk coffee together, that Sandra had brought flowers for her mother's grave and had stood there for a long time without saying anything, that it had been uncomfortable and also, I thought, necessary. Eleanor would have said, "Give her time." So I'm giving her time. Derek's trial date has been set for September. I will not attend unless I'm called as a witness, which seems likely. I've testified in federal court more times than I can easily count. I know what it looks like from the stand. I know what it feels like to have a defense attorney attempt to characterize your motives in terms that make the jury uncomfortable. I'm prepared for all of it. I've been preparing for situations like this most of my adult life. What I was less prepared for was the quiet. The house is mine again, in the way that it stopped being mine for a while, not legally. They never managed to touch it legally, but in the lived sense. The sense that when I walk through the front door, I am not calculating anyone's angle or managing anyone's perception of my competence. I make coffee at whatever time I want. I have Ray over on Tuesday afternoons, and his voice carries and nobody says a word about it. I watch the news too loudly. I use the front door. It sounds like nothing. It sounds like the ordinary texture of an ordinary life. That's exactly what it is. And I have spent enough time watching people lose ordinary things to understand what it means to have them back. Last week, I drove into Burlington for a continuing education seminar at the law school. They'd invited a handful of retired practitioners to speak to first-year students about courtroom ethics. I said a few things, answered a few questions. On my way out, I stopped in the corridor in front of my photograph. One of the students, young woman, couldn't have been 23, stopped beside me and looked at it. "Do you know him?" she asked. "Reasonably well," I said. She looked closer. "Were you a prosecutor?" 31 years. She seemed to be working something out. What was the hardest case? I thought about it on the drive home. I didn't have a good answer for her then, and I'm not sure I have one now. I've prosecuted murderers and people who laundered money for cartels, and a man who ran a trafficking operation across 3 state lines. Those were hard cases in the technical sense, the legal sense. The hardest thing I've ever done was sit at my kitchen table in November and listen to my daughter tell me I was declining, and keep my face exactly neutral, and say, "I appreciate your concern," because I had to see the whole shape of it first. Because rushing would have cost me more than waiting. Because 30 years of building cases teaches you that the most important skill in the room isn't the one on display. It's the one you're holding in reserve. I turned 73 in May. Ray took me to dinner. Frank sent a bottle of whiskey I haven't opened yet but intend to. Sandra sent a card with a photograph inside a picture I hadn't seen before, taken at Eleanor's garden some years ago. In it, Eleanor and I are both laughing at something. Neither of us is looking at the camera. In the background, just at the edge of the frame, Sandra is also laughing. I put it on the desk in my study, not next to the framed court document. On the other side, by the window, the side that looks out over the field. I live alone. The house is mine. I have my walks, my routine, my quiet mornings. I have Frank and Ray, and the hawks over the back field. I have 31 years of case files that the law school library has requested and will eventually receive. I have Eleanor's garden, which I am attempting to maintain according to her notes, with mixed results. Some people believe that the quiet ones are harmless, that men my age who keep to themselves and speak carefully have put everything behind them. That patience is the same as passivity, that a man who doesn't react is a man without options. I have always found it more effective to let people believe that.